Hello, this is the first lecture on chapter 24 of Miguel Roig-Francolí's book, Harmony in Context. I'm going to be discussing the flat 2/6 chord today, which is sometimes called the Neapolitan chord. Okay, so since we've been talking about modal mixture, we know what it means when you have a flat in front of a Roman numeral. If we're in the key of A minor, the chord that we call flat 2 would be built on the lowered scale degree 2. So it would not be B, but rather it would be B flat. Okay, and usually this chord is in first inversion, so it's actually a flat 2/6 chord. The lowered scale degree 2, which is the root of the chord, has a solfege syllable of Ra. You could write that out R-A. So when I say Ra, what I'm talking about is that note that's a half step above tonic. Take a look at the scale degrees that make up this chord. It has flat 2, which, as I said, is called Ra. It has scale degree 4, which is Fa. And then it has this note, the note a half step above Sol, which is lay. And if we were in a major key, if we were in the key of, let's say, A major, in order to spell the flat 2/6 chord, we'd have to use the B flat and an F natural to get both Ra and lay in there. This chord is sometimes referred to as the Neapolitan chord, so you theory students can refer to it as the ice cream chord if you want to. Sometimes it's called the Neapolitan sixth because of its common presence in first inversion. The name Neapolitan means that it comes from Naples, a city in southern Italy. So historically, that's a place where composers often used this flat 2 chord, although they didn't invent it. Let's compare the flat 2 chord to two other predominant chords. Flat 2/6 is a very strong predominant chord. It wants to go to dominant. And so let's compare it to 4, and let's compare it to 2 diminished 6. Okay. I should have said this at the start of the lecture, but it would be very useful for you to have in front of you my handout on the flat 2/6 chord. It's just a one-page handout. It's very concentrated, but that will have some of this information on it, and it will also give you a good place where you can take some notes. Okay, so here are these three chords. All of them have D as the lowest note, which is Fa. All of them have lay, which is F. The 4 chord has a Do. The 2 diminished 6 chord doesn't have a Do, instead it has a Re. The flat 2/6 chord has the note that's halfway in between. So again, these 3 chords are very similar. It's not an accident that they all act as predominant chords, leading us to a 5 chord. But they do it in slightly different ways, with the 3rd note in each case being slightly different. I'm going to share my screen and show you part of that handout. Again, it would be helpful if you were looking at a paper copy of the handout. I'm going to go through this handout, which is kind of an overall summary. It has some information which I've already covered, and it has some information which I'll cover in lectures 2 and 3. I think it's helpful to get all of this information in one place. So first of all, the handout has the comparison among the 4 chord, the 2 diminished 6 chord, and the flat 2/6 chord that I just showed you on the board. Let's go to the next bullet point. And this shows you the way that the flat 2/6 or the flat 2 root position chord more often works into the circle of fifths. Anytime you go through a circle of fifths progression in a diatonic key, there needs to be one diminished fifth or augmented fourth, replacing a perfect fifth or a perfect fourth. Normally, when we do this in a diatonic key without chromatic chords, the tritone will be either between 4 and 7 if you're in a major key, or between 6 and 2 if you're in a minor key. For the first half of this line, you have the circle of fifths progression in A minor. And you can see here with the bracket that the tritone is a diminished fifth between 6 and 2 diminished. So as we move into that dissonant diminished chord, we also have the melodic dissonance of a diminished fifth. So listen to the first circle of fifths progression here with the diatonic chord 2 diminished in root position. Hear how you have that 6 to 2 diminished, that dissonant chord leading us to 5, and then to 1. Well, if we replace the 2 diminished chord with a flat 2 chord, and again, this chord is going to be in root position, which means that we will be doubling the scale degree flat 2. In the upper voice, it's going to move down by diminished third, and in the bass, it's going to move by augmented fourth. But in this progression, we now have a perfect fifth from the 6 chord to the flat 2 chord. We have F to B flat. And the dissonant interval is now an augmented fourth, and it happens actually as the flat 2 chord resolves to 5. So it increases the expressivity of that resolution to 5, and it makes the chord lead all the more strongly into that dominant chord. Here's what the circle of fifths sounds like with the flat 2 chord. So again, you have this 6 going to flat 2, and now we move to 5. It's a very strange chord progression with root motion by tritone. A little bit of summary information about the flat 2 chord. It's found a little bit more frequently in minor keys than it is in major keys, and the reason is that it fits in better with minor. Minor keys already have a lay, so you don't need that accidental in the flat 2 chord, which has Ra, Fa, lay. And the one accidental that you do need in a minor key is not too far removed from the key signature. So if you think about A minor, the note Ra, B flat, occurs only one click away in the circle of fifths progression. D minor or F major, which are just adjacent to A minor in the circle of fifths, would have a B flat. So it's not a highly chromatic chord, it's just a little chromatic. In major keys, the flat 2 chord is a little bit less comfortably situated within the key. You need the flat 2 and the flat 6 scale degrees, and you're moving rather a distance on the circle of fifths. For that reason, in major keys, the flat 2 chord is usually used in the context of modal mixture. So you may have chords like flat 6 or minor 4 as you lead into the flat 2 chord. We've already talked about how flat 2 is most often used in first inversion, and how we should double the bass note of the chord. In my next lecture, I'll go into more detail about voice leading. Let me just note here that when the bass of a flat 2/6 moves up to the 5, the typical thing is for all the upper voices to move down, and that should be familiar to you, the idea of moving upper voices in contrary motion to the bass. If we go to a 5 triad, all of the upper voices will move down. If we go to a 5/7 chord, this is typically an incomplete 5/7. 2 of the upper voices will move down, but Fa will stay as a common tone and become the 7th of 5/7. Now, apart from the fact that it sounds kind of cool, what's the point of using the flat 2 or flat 2-6 chord? Well, one reason is that when it replaces the unstable 2 diminished chord, the flat 2 or flat 2-6 can do some things that 2 diminished can't do. Most notably, flat 2 or flat 2-6 can be prolonged over several measures. You can have a really lengthy presentation of that chord without it sounding sort of weird and gnarly and dissonant, because it's a major triad. Also, the flat 2 chord can be tonicized, unlike the diatonic 2 diminished chord. Remember that diminished chords can't be tonicized. Let me skip down to the last bullet point. When the flat 2 chord is tonicized, it's tonicized by its own dominant, which in a minor key is 6, and in a major key is flat 6. So if you have a 6 or a flat 6 chord leading to a flat 2, it's perfectly acceptable to call the first chord a 5 of flat 2. On the other hand, if that first chord is turned into a major minor 7th, if we have lay, do, may, and then say, which is the lowered form of sol, then we have to label it as a secondary dominant. We have to call it 5-7 of flat 2, because 6-7 or flat 6-7 is supposed to be a major 7th chord, not a major minor 7th chord. And finally, just a reminder, and this was implicit in my discussing the circle of fifths progression, flat 2 can be used in root position as well. And in some cases, it may also have a chord 7th, which is most often a major 7th chord. Every now and then you see a minor 7th chord as well. And if you do use this chord in root position, you should still double the bass note so that you always have a complete flat 2 triad in the upper voices. And that concludes lecture 1.